Institute for European Policy Making at Bocconi, and welcome to today's webinar, as we call it. It's a webinar on European issues. And this is a very important event to us because it's one of the many outcomes of the cooperation between YEP and Opinions, which is an important project connected with Bertelsmann Foundation. And this is a super hot topic, as you can imagine from the title, Italy, the War and the Vote. This is part of a broader project that Opinions is working on, has been working on for I think, years now, which is a regular survey about what Europeans think on many issues, especially on the war. And the outcome is particularly relevant in this moment that the war is getting more complicated and the outcome is less predictable. The two speakers today will be Isabel Hoffmann. She's a senior expert at Bertelsmann Stiftung, Bertelsmann Foundation, and she's the head of the project Opinions. She has been working with the other speaker, Catherine de Vries, for years, and they have both just published co-authored a very important report about how to say, about the relevance of Ursula von der Leyen in shaping the meaning, the role of European Commission President. You can find it online on our website. So my role is just to remember you to subscribe our new monthly newsletter. You find the link in the chat, and to check out our new LinkedIn pages and our website. I also remember you that you will find all the materials of the webinar online, and that we are going to have an event in Rome related to our cooperation with Opinions in June. So stay tuned with our communications. So with no further ado, I leave the floor to Catherine, and she will run the first part of the presentation. Then Isabel will take on from after Catherine, and then we will have at least 20 minutes of Q&A. So you are welcome in writing your question in the chat or raising your digital hand to ask, to comment and to intervene. Thank you so much. Catherine, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Stefano, for the introduction. I'm also very happy to be here. Welcome to everyone, and also great to be here with my indeed long-standing partner in crime, Isabel Hoffmann, working on these issues. So Stefano was very right that it's a high-stake event. So another high-stake event, the war in Ukraine and the relationship with the European Union and the European continent with Russia, and a more let's say, aggressive Russia that we've seen over the last years. But in the election campaigns that we've seen so far, not only in Italy, but also in other countries, actually, it's played much less of a role, even though indirectly it's played a role where a lot of inflation discussions and rising pricing discussions, of course, have a link to the war, but that's not always so easy to see for individuals. We saw last week that French President Emmanuel Macron was also a bit complaining about the lack of, let's say, mindset in European capitals around the war and what it means, and that this is a real challenge for the European Union. So what we actually wanted to do, and we've been doing that already for a while, is to get a sense of what European voters think about the war. And even if it's maybe not the most issue that's being discussed in European parliamentary election, it will be very interesting to see how different political groups or people who have certain political leanings think about these issues, and also broader issues about Europe's response to this war, and perhaps European defense priorities in the future. We can move to the next slide. And in the Italian context, I think we should go one before. Yeah, exactly. In the Italian context, this has been particularly pertinent because in the international media, if we remember, there was quite some uncertainty about the changing government that we saw from the Draghi government to the Meloni government, in the sense that Fratelli Italia, as a more hard-right party, some of these type of parties in other political systems, for example, the system, I'm by birth Dutch, we have a far-right party that is very let's say, unwilling to provide support for Ukraine, especially when it would mean financial support or economic support or military support. So there were some contentions in the international media. How would the new Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni position herself? Will it be a break from the Draghi government, which was very explicitly pro-Ukraine, which we saw with visits of Mario Draghi with other prime ministers to the Ukrainian president and to the Ukrainian frontline? But actually, Giorgia Meloni, to the maybe surprise of some international commentators, maybe perhaps less to Italian commentators that already saw her commitment to Ukraine earlier on before the election, so that she's different from, let's say, other parties like Lega, for example, or maybe even Forza Italia, where we know, of course, that the previous prime minister of that and leader of that party had close connections with Putin, that there has been actually an upholding of this Italian government position. So sometimes this is not necessarily in line with the voter position. So that's going to be something that we want to watch, in the sense of how do the kind of supporters of Giorgia Meloni and also of other parties in her government see this kind of support for Ukraine. So specifically against the backdrop of the upcoming European Parliament election, we have been asking a set of questions. Here there are four. I'll just read them out to you. Does the European Union need a common defense policy? Should the EU support Ukraine by delivering weapons? Should your country accept refugees from Ukraine? Should the EU accept Ukraine as a member state in coming years? So that has to do with accession. Then should the EU become more energy dependent of Russia, even if that means rising prices? So what we've seen, do you think that the economic and financial sanctions on Russia are effective or ineffective? And do you think that the reconstruction of Ukraine will be an economic opportunity or an economic burden for the European Union? And what we did is that we polled that, and Isabel will talk about kind of the EU averages. We polled that in the EU as a whole and a subset of member state countries, and then specifically, which I will focus on first, the Italian data. So let's see the first slide. So just this was data from December 2023, because we do that before the European parliamentary election. Of course, things have changed, as Stefan also talked about. At that time already, it looked where the initial surprise was that Ukraine was standing hard against Russian aggression. We've seen more of a weakening and some advancements on the Russian side, even since the period of December 2023. And that also, at least makes this a very important conflict, and also existential, because there might be worries that this would, not constrain itself to Ukraine if we're following what's going on today in Georgia, where there are demonstrations on the street surrounding a law that is going to bring Georgia away, maybe perhaps in the European Union, if it was adopted, more towards Russia. So, of course, these concerns about a regional conflict are still there. So we polled in December 2023 just closeness of a political party. Note, this is not are you going to vote for a party, but it's a question a lot of political scientists use in order to get really kind of the core of an electorate of a political party. And that's important because it gives signals to party leaders about how their position taking is actually, let's say, perceived by their core base. So what we see in Italy, like in many other European countries, a big difference from, let's say, the 70s or the 80s, we see really a majority, let's say the largest party in Italy is people who feel close to no party, i.e. who are actually going to see by election which party they will support. Then we see a considerable share of the Italian respondents feeling close to almost the two extremes of the political systems of Movimento 5 Stelle, so that's on the left right-hand side, and Fratelli Italia, which would be more on the right side. Other parties, Lega, much smaller than it has been, of course. Forza Italia, which is, of course, something that also me as a political scientist was kind of interested to see what would happen after the death of its founder, but actually has kept a footing, which we also see in the polls. And then the major party on the left, Partito Democratico. So this is, again, not vote shares. This is just people feeling close to political parties. But these are the kind of shares that you will see when we break down the support questions for defense, for Ukraine, for sanctions towards Russia by different groups. And those are based on this question, do you feel close to a political party? So let's look now at the percentages for the different questions. So this is one of the key questions that's now on the agenda and should also be, be a key issue in the electoral campaign. You don't necessarily see that as much, as I said, yet, but the campaign is still going strong. But you see interventions like Macron, like others, on this idea that should the European Union need some form of common defense. What that would look like, of course, is very particular. What we have experienced over years of experience with polling people, that asking about nitty-gritty of EU policymaking is very difficult, because people's knowledge about, very insight knowledge about the EU is not really there. So we usually ask more kind of general perceptions, so in this case, common defense policy. So widespread in Italy, which is also a country where overall support for membership in this bond, especially after Next Generation EU funding was released, is very high. And also steps for further integration is, in our data, generally supported by the Italian population. And interestingly, we don't see that much variation across political parties, exactly also not among parties who are more on the, let's say, left fringe of the political system, or more on the right fringe of the political system. Actually, consistent, strong support for common defense policy. And on the next slide. So that picture changes here. So it's being in favor or being against. Should the EU be actually delivering weapons to Ukraine? So there's different discussions about this. There's a general old discussion among the left, especially in the Italian context. Well, should we actually be engaging in forms of weaponized conflicts abroad? Also some, still some skepticism around NATO that's linked has historical roots also on the left. The similar type of messages you can also see on the right, where maybe actually delivering weapons, would be a step too far, or would be perceived maybe with somewhat more skepticism. And that partly, of course, is also a question of how much preparedness do you need if this is a serious kind of threat? Do you also need to make sure that your own weapon stock is at a certain level, right? So it's not an easy question maybe also to answer. So what we see is that the Italian population is much more split. Overall, 40% in favor of delivering weapons to Ukraine, 60% against. We see the highest support for delivering weapons actually among PD, which maybe is a more general kind of EU related stance, but also very interestingly, quite high, 50-50 among Fratelli Italia supporters. So that, of course, fits very much the messages of Meloni, which has been much more, in defense of Ukraine. We see weakest support among Movimento 5 Stelle, so Five Star Movement, and Lega, maybe also not entirely surprising. Of the other parties is also much more of a 50-50 split. So whereas there's clear support for common defense policy, this is much less the case when it comes to delivering weapons to Ukraine, which maybe also shows some reluctance, not just in Rome, but also in other European capitals about actually delivering some of that. On the next slide. So should your country accept refugees from Ukraine? Well, that is, of course, very stark contrast with overall slight anti-immigration sentiment across European countries, especially on the right. You see here supporters of Lega, supporters of Fratelli Italia, being very supportive of accepting refugees from Ukraine. This is also clearly a reflection of what party leaders do is important for what people think, because even a very strongly anti-immigration politician, historically also in Italy, has been Matteo Salvini, but he took a very different line when it came to Ukrainian refugees, where he was much more supportive of that, and that we see reflected in Italian public opinion. And actually, this has stayed quite remarkably stable across the period. We've started to really look at this really after the war, and we're still at very high percentages. Again, the highest among PD, so Partito Democratico, the Social Democratic Party in Italy. On the next slide. So should the EU accept Ukraine as a member of the European Union in coming years? So what we've seen in, of course, post the outbreak of the war, that there's been a lot of discussion among over enlargement. Just also remind ourselves that enlargement, if we would have polled this in, let's say, 2018, we would not get majorities among the European public above enlargement. Enlargement was no longer, let's say, a popular issue, neither among politicians nor among the public. But when we ask specifically about Ukraine, there's very clear support of wanting to welcome Ukraine, which was reflected, of course, also in the start of making Ukraine a formal accession state. It's about 66% overall in the Italian population, 80% among PD supporters, but also 65%, 67% for Lega, Forza Italia 71, but also on the more left side of the political spectrum, the Five Star Movement, 67%. So that's a quite high support, a little bit less among those who are undecided, but that's quite considerable. Of course, this does not necessarily mean, we saw it with delivering of weapons already before, and we actually are going to see it in some slides from now, it might not mean that as accession really comes about, that this will be consistently high. Right? It will also be very important for politicians to shape a narrative around why it's so important to have Ukraine access, and even if there would be an economic or political burden for other member states, why it would be important to do this nonetheless. So it'll be interesting to watch these numbers moving forward. But since we've started polling, this has been quite high. On the next slide. So also, should the EU become more energy independent of Russia, even if that means rising, that we are going to be witnessing rising prices? So here we also see even the willingness, and that's also, of course, because governments took these steps. I think we see really that this resonated also with their party constituencies. 67, so good 2/3 of the population being in favor of that. We see it also among the left. Five Star Movement PD again the highest, but also among Lega and Brothers of Italy, Fratelli Italia. So that is also again a quite interesting aspect. We have been looking a little bit at Bocconi with another group as if people really experience the price hikes, we do see that it decreases a little bit. So when there is really hardship, this might go down, but overall people are committed actually to do this, let's say, for sake of becoming more energy independent of Russia, which is quite considerable in a country where there was a lot of gas dependency, like Germany, for example, like other Central European countries, on energy coming from Russia. The next slide. So this is very interesting. This was a point of contention also among the political elites in Italy. We can think of Matteo Salvini being quite open about that. That to what degree should you harm, quote unquote, your own economy also by no longer trading with Russia, or should you also be committing to sanctions? So the sanctions support has never been very high, to be honest. But what we also really see is that there's an increase since the war came out, and that is, I think, just a realism among the public that these sanctions might not be really working, because we actually see that the Russian economy hasn't collapsed. It's partly, of course, the kind of stand-in of China and India that have taken up more gas and oil deliveries from Russia. But people also feel that overall these sanctions are not very effective. Clearly, 57% of the Italian public thinks that the sanctions are ineffective. About still a quarter doesn't really know what to say. And actually, the pattern is quite strong, clearly among the highest level of kind of thinking that sanctions are effective is about 1/3 of PD supporters, but overall the majority in the Italian public thinks that these sanctions are not very effective. It doesn't, of course, mean that people then would like to see trade with Russia developing again. I think that's not what we should at all take from this data, but it is this sense that maybe sanctions is not an effective tool to constrain Russia in this particular conflict. And on the next slide. So then, of course, the next step, we saw it already with Ukraine accession, and then the next step will be, well, in order for, we don't know what the timeline will be on Ukraine accession. The question of economic reconstruction of Ukraine is really important, and it would also be important to see the extent to which people think this might actually be something that would help the European Union. If you think about having access to a huge market, or and also a moral imperative of helping a country after war, in the same way that, of course, European countries had the spirit of European integration was to create reconstruction after the Second World War and to integrate countries that previously were enemies into a peaceful project together, for which, of course, the European Union got a Nobel Peace Prize as well. To what extent do we see similar sentiments when it comes to Ukraine? we asked the question, do you think that reconstruction of Ukraine will be an economic opportunity or economic burden? I can be fully aware that, of course, you would want to maybe ask some more specific things. But again, I just want to remind you that for a general public, it's not so easy to know all the nitty-gritties about these kind of, let alone that we know as experts more what's going to happen. So you see a very split picture here. People are very willing to support, remember, Ukraine accession, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they think that this will be an easy route. They have an idea that this might be difficult. It's about 50-50 or 48% that think it as an economic opportunity. 52% think about it as an economic burden. The highest kind of thinking about this in a 50-50 way would be Fratelli d'Italia, Brothers of Italy. 50% think it's an opportunity, 50% it's a burden. PD, 58% think that it's an opportunity, 42% it's a burden. And we see a little bit lower among Lega. 39% think it will be only think that it will be an economic opportunity. 61% think it will be an economic burden. Also, Movimento 5 Stelle, 42% think it will be an economic opportunity only, whereas the majority, 57%, think it will be a burden. So we really see a little bit of a difference here between PD, Forza Italia, and Brothers of Italy, in them, in their the people that feel closest to those parties, thinking that at least it's a 50-50 draw, or it's slightly more an opportunity than it's a burden. So I think this was the last slide, if I'm not mistaken, Isabel, on the Italian data. So I will hand over to Isabel on the European data, I think, to try to see how it is in a perspective. But I do think what is interesting, to come back to the first thing that I saw, that there was some international, let's say, worries perhaps about the transatlantic stance and the stance on the Ukrainian issue specifically, or the Ukrainian war specifically, of Giorgia Meloni. I think that is not burned out. It's not burned out in her own position, but it's also not burned out in the position of her supporters, although it doesn't mean that people are always willing to deliver weapons, or to think that it will be an easy route to access, to have Ukraine access the European Union. So maybe now it'd be interesting to put this in a European perspective. So I hand over to Isabel.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you also for inviting me. Happy to be here. Unfortunately, I can't see you because I share my screen. But let me start with this. I'm happy to give you a little bit of a European perspective here, and let me first start by telling you what is similar to what you're going to see, and what is different what you're going to see. So when it comes to European context, obviously we have a harder time to ask about party political preferences. So we basically save ourselves and ask about political orientation. The question is, on a left-right wing scale, where do you position yourself? And it starts with, what ends, depending on where you want to go, with extreme left, center right, right, extreme right. So these are the options. And then we correlate them with the same set of questions towards European policies that Catherine just presented. However, we decided to do not give you the full scale of question, but only a selection, and you will see why, because the information in the different graphs themselves is quite intense. And so we will probably spend a little bit more time with every single graph in order to understand it. However, I refer you, if you are interested in the full set of data, to our website, our Opinions website. You might see it behind on the screen, on my screen. It's opinions.eu, and there you get not only the War and the Vote report, that is the European data that I'm going to show to you, but all the 7 country reports that we have put out, the Italian one, a German one, a Polish one, a French one, a Dutch one, a Belgian one, a Spanish one. I think I did not forget any. Anyhow, let's get in the meat of this. And let me start with this graph. It's basically the mirror to what Catherine presented to you in the first step. There you saw the general distribution of party preferences and sympathizers in Italy. Here you see how people in the EU position themselves on a left-wing, right-wing scale. And you see how people in these 7 member states, we do poll differently, position themselves in a left-wing, right-wing scale. As a matter of general introduction and understanding, this is basically the setup you're going to see in every single slide. So on top, you will see the data for the EU 27, then the Belgian, the French, the German, the Italian, the Dutch, the Polish, and the Spanish data. I will first show you the general distribution, so the general answers to the different questions, policy related, and then the correlation with this data. So here you see it's fair. When you look at the EU data, it's fairly equally distributed. These people who position themselves on the right or on the left, you see a stronger center. Then you see people position themselves a little bit more on the fringes. You see 60% basically positioning themselves in the political center, and 40% positioning themselves rather on the edges of the political system. When you look when you go through the different countries, you see that some have a tendency with the majority position themselves on the political right. France comes to mind if you go through the list from the top to the bottom. The Netherlands, very pronouncedly so. Italy, fairly evenly distributed. Germany and Spain on the other end. The joke doesn't work anymore, but the picture for Germany is similar for quite some years now. When we had Merkel government, always could joke that, you know, most 60% of Germans, almost 60% of Germans back then positioned themselves on the left and on the center left. However, you know, a center conservative, center right government gets re-elected every time they get to the polls. However, now with the Green and Social Democrat government doesn't work anymore that much. Anyhow, does the EU need a common defense policy? Here we go. A question that gets outrageously high support. I cannot emphasize enough that obviously these numbers we hardly ever see. It is a question that has a lot of sympathy right now. If you look at the phrasing of the question, if you look at the implication of the question, you could easily see why. There is a high stress level in our societies, a high sense of risk and danger. On a general and on a personal level, more on a general level, however, it does have an effect. Defense sounds good, common sounds good, hence a large support. What I'm always tempted to say, I'm not going to say it now, is what lies in the nature of such a picture is that the ideas of what a common defense policy should look like will be vastly different when you have such high numbers of support, right? So the idea appeals to a lot of people. If you go in the meat of things and in the detail of things, obviously, and that would be in the nature of democratic societies as well, the spelling out of and the look and feel of it, how this should become about, would be obviously vastly different. If you look at the distribution by political orientation, however, please keep in mind that such an overwhelming a majority said yes to this question. And here you see, as I explained to you, the EU data is on top. Belgium, French, German, Italian, Dutch, Polish, Spain come following after that. Then you see on the upper line, you see the yes question distribution by yes, then the no. The former question was answered overwhelmingly with yes, so the yes group are the much larger group, the no question are the much weaker groups. However, what you see, the distribution is fairly similar. You see in quite a lot of countries a little bit a draw to the left when it comes to supporting this, a little bit more opposition on the right when it comes to supporting this. However, a strong support in the center in every single country. Let's go into the details. Should the EU support Ukraine by delivering weapons? You have seen the data for Italy, 40% saying yes. In Italy, 60% saying no. The Italians were always on the much lower end, those who supported this notion the least ever since the beginning of the war, and it has declined ever since. Maybe I should mention that we are asking this question ever since the war broke out, so March 22, every 3 months. So you have quite a fair understanding of how support evolved over these policy-related questions. When you look at the EU data and the other country data, you see that in most countries in the EU as a whole, there's a majority supporting the notion of the EU delivering weapons. Even in Germany, however, it is weaker than in most other member states that we see here. And it has been a little bit declining everywhere, also in a country like Poland, even though Poland support is still very strong. So now, political orientation, because this is what we're here for. It's a bit of a similar picture, because there's a lot of information on this slide. I recommend you to kind of focus on the middle, where basically the red and the blue meet, and there you see a lot of what is playing out here. So again, a much stronger support when you look at those positioning themselves in the center, be it left or right. But when you regroup and look at the left as a common group and the right as a common group, then you see that there tends to be more support on the left than on the right, more opposition on the right, more support on the left. It's a bit complicated. I give you a couple of minutes to check it out yourself. If you look at Italy, you remember that in Italy there were more people positioning. No, it was fairly equally distributed in Italy, the positioning on the left and on the right. However, here you see as well a little bit more support for delivering weapons on the left, those who self-identify on the left, a little bit more opposition of those who self-identify on the right. Next slide, refugees. You remember general support, and this what you see here as well. In Italy, quite high, but in general quite high. These numbers have also moved a bit, particularly in the countries that have welcomed quite a lot of Ukrainians, namely Poland, also Germany, but still there is a clear majority supporting the notion that accepting refugees of war from Ukraine is almost an obligation here. So by political orientation, I'm going to sound like a broken record. However, you know, when you have a pattern, it also helps to see a little bit more clearly more center on the right, fewer support on the fringes, a little bit more support on the left, more opposition on the right. Obviously, for certain countries, this does not match entirely, but it is a pattern that you find again and again when you look at it, at the data as a whole. Look at the Italian case, it's even more pronounced, right? There you see it very, very clearly. So last question, do you think the reconstruction of Ukraine will be an economic burden or an economic opportunity? Let me start by saying, if you go through the list of questions that Catherine presented and now the sub-selection that I presented, you can see a certain trend there. First, when you asked about this larger notions like the defense policy, and I try to explain why I think it gets such high support right now, you see that the principle of acting together in tense or complicated situation gets large support, tends to get large support, and we see it in other times of crisis in touching other policy areas. When you get into the more detail, asking about more detailed about certain policies, the question gets a little bit more diverse. However, these policy-related questions have gotten a majority, a large support, a majority of Europeans supported, and in the different member states as well. And we've seen this support being kept up over time in quite a stable fashion, in a much stable fashion than most of the experts actually expected, and also policymaker expected. And I think it is an attitude that we now can say it's not unmovable, but we can rely on it. However, there is an important exception to the rule. When you asked about issues touching upon the financial and the economic, the picture switches, and you see it with this question as well. And you saw it with the sanction question, and Catherine pointed it out. The issue gets much leaker, and I think it is also a sentiment that is picked up in the campaign, and we pointed that out quite early by the end of last year, and we tried to connect that with a message to political parties. You need to address that, because we do see that issues that do not get addressed are exploited by those who have less to lose, more to win. We will see whether we help to get that message right. When I look at the campaign in Germany, I say, well, it's not that much addressed. It's more about threat of democracy and the threat to the right. That is at least what's quite dominating here. However, one last look at the distribution by political orientation. More support in the center, be it political left or political right, a little bit more support on the left than on the right. But keep in mind, there was more of a pessimism when it came to the question than an optimism. Okay, I will stop here. I'm looking forward to your question. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Isabel. Thank you, Catherine. I think that some of these results were expected, others were completely surprising. And I think this is a good moment to start our conversation. So I remind you again to raise your hand or to write in the chat. Meanwhile, I wasn't raising my hand. While you think what to ask or what kind of comments you have, I would just ask you to go back to the Italian slides, because I take the opportunity to ask a question. Okay, we have Daniel. So I ask my question very quickly, and then I give the floor to Daniel. How do you explain that people in Italy are so keen to receive refugees? Probably because we do not have any refugee from Ukraine, and they are so hostile to sending weapons, while at the same moment they need they say that they need a European defense. How do these two things square together? If you don't want to send weapons, but you want a European army, I assume that it doesn't mean that you want to fight in first person and you want European soldiers over there, because I mean the narrative that the Ukrainians push is that they are the true European army. They are fighting on behalf of Europe. So in their narrative, sending weapons to them is the closest thing you can do to hire contractors fighting for Europe, or to have a European army because they are fighting for us. That's their narrative. So that's my point. Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. I thought we should have given first our presenters time to reply to your observation.
Yeah, maybe I can do it. I mean, it's not an easy question. I think what you usually have, and we've done other questions where it's more a trade-off, like where we do, for example, we've done that in terms of how you would like a reform in the European Union to look like, and you have a trade-off. It's always tricky when you ask people kind of one question, right? Because as you said, and Isabel also referred to that, it's different nitty-gritty aspects of that. So I think that the way I would read these these results, as you say, is that the message. So what I think is that people don't walk around. That's also what we need as policy wonks need to kind of be very careful about. Like they're not walking around thinking about, oh, what policy direction should the EU go? Or like when they go and have a drink, let's say in the bar, those conversations are more likely going to be about football than they're going to be about, like, let's say, the key challenges of the European Union, right? So that's, I think, so people are getting this. But I think that what we saw already in earlier data from the 70s is that the idea that the European Union, that there should be a European dimension in defense has never been very contested in the eyes of European voters. It's been very contested in the eyes of European elites, right? I mean, the European Defense Union was struck down in French Parliament. There's a lot of discussion about how you would do that. But I do think that Stefana, you're right. It doesn't mean, and we've seen some data as well in, for example, countries like Finland, Sweden, Denmark, where there were discussions about reintroducing conscription, right? That people are quite wary to themselves. They go, like, and I think that would also be with this idea of like, I think that there's quite a lot of support in principle, but it doesn't mean when push comes to shove, when you need to pay, when you need to put in there, that support is always the same. So I think that's where the key aspect is. And then we know that from other policy issues, that there you would need to have elites queuing very strongly on what does it mean to support Ukraine? And I think when it comes to, for example, delivering weapons, partly because elites have not been willing because of their own weapon stock, or because weapon stocks are actually not, to be honest, Europe has been on a geopolitical vacation for the last 50 years, so it hasn't had the kind of stocks that are probably needed. So elites are also not so in their rhetoric, this does not come first of mind, right? Where in the US, what is the key first of mind is, well, we're delivering all these weapon packages. So the discussion now also with the US and Israel and Gaza. So I think that is also a reflection of where you see that people think that the European Union should do something, but if that means that they themselves need to forfeit something, you would need to probably have quite a good elite narrative for that to be accepted. Otherwise, people are going to think with their pocketbooks. They're going to think, like, what are the trade-offs for me? And I think that's the kind of key issue. And that, I think, is also what Isabel tried to say. But like in the nitty-gritty of what that would mean and what that implementation would mean, like you might see quite different results. So that's, I think, how I would read. I think there is a principled position, and the principled position of supporting you also see in refugee support. And to be fair, it's not higher in countries that have more Ukrainian refugees or not. Actually, it's quite considerably like high across countries. And actually, if you look at the European perspective, Italy has taken in not as much as Poland, of course, right, but has taken in quite considerable shares of Ukrainian refugees, right? So I think that that is kind of seen as a moral duty, but then having boots on the ground, putting a lot of like weapons there. I mean, that I think is just an issue where you would probably, if you wanted the public to move more in that direction, there need to be very strong signals from elites that that's what needs to be done. And the signals on refugees on elites, actually, there's been students at Bocconi that have looked at the rhetoric early on, also of a party like Lega, has been very positive on Ukraine. So I think that's the kind of reflection what you see. So if you wanted to develop this further and to provide that level of support, it needs to come from stronger queuing from the public. So that from the elites, that's how I would read that those differences.
Thank you so much, Daniel.
In a sense, my question follows up on what Catherine just said. I was wondering, to what extent are these opinion poll results actually predictive of what countries have actually done? How much weapons and or financial support they have delivered? And I see Catherine shaking her head, meaning they are not.
Well, I mean, the thing is that there is some, it's like there, for example, so I guess the question is a little bit, I mean, there's some contention about what countries actually have delivered, right? There's also some contention about what the EU says versus what country says. And then secondly, I think that you don't see necessarily that support for weapons is the highest among those that have delivered weapons, because those would be also bigger countries, right? If you look at this, like who's going to be delivering more. But I think what you do see is that the countries that are closer to the conflict, right, that their support for some of these measures is higher. So I think it is more a kind of preemptive than a, let's say, after the fact rationalization of what your country has done.
I give you my own interpretation, which is that taking into account proximity to the conflict, you see a very strong negative correlation between the amount of public debt and the amount of aid delivered to Ukraine. Countries with high public debt tend to deliver less because, of course, they think they have a tighter budget constraint, but okay, that's something else. For Isabel, I wanted to check a bit on the inner German discussion, left and right, that you also showed, and the policy which this government has followed, which is that after some initial hesitation, they are now almost without telling the public, the German public at least, they have become one of the major supporters in financial terms, at least, of Ukraine. Is that because they are afraid of public opinion, or what is the reason? And here I see another one of these differences that Isabel mentioned between what elite does and what public opinion polls tell us.
Yeah, thank you. It's very interesting, because I think you see here the force of a traditional narrative that clashes with data like ours, and actual decision making, and then policy pursued by government. And you see that these things quite often and quite confusingly can take very different pathways. And from my experience, no data in the world is going to change people's minds how it really is. So we can put out. So the war started, there was the notion the German public doesn't support this, the German government is hesitant because the German public doesn't support it, and because they have, this sort of party history that in the end their party supporters do not support it. And, the German public in large is cautious. The supporters of those in government tend by their history to be in opposition of policies related to war. Thus, you see government action that is slow at first, and then when they actually get up to speed, once again, nobody notices it. So, it's just interesting because we could not, this narrative, I cannot say whether it is true or not, because, then we would get into a question of the power of narratives and how it actually then shapes reality. But what I can tell you is that, at least in our data, it was hardly ever reflected. So we asked, the war broke out in February 22. In March 22, we asked for the first time about the defense policy, about weapon delivery, about energy independence, about all these questions you just saw. And there was extremely high level of support. Most surprisingly to me, for example, was the support that all of the sudden jumped up when it came to the notion of enlargement. And we not only asked about enlargement, including Ukraine into the EU, but we also asked about support for enlargement in general. And I can tell you, in the years before, we every once in a while asked about enlargement. Nobody ever. So there was 70% of people telling us, no. So what it tells you is there was not very much interest, I would say, in the notion. The war breaks out by the end of February. In March, 60-70% of people tell us yes, not only to the notion of including Ukraine into the EU, but also the notion of enlarging the EU in a general. What it tells you, a shock like this will move positions very fast and can move position from one extreme to the other. When awareness hits people and the stakes basically come to their mind, they are able to switch position very fast. And no politician in the EU had time to get into the weeds of explaining them that now enlargement is important, which is, when you look at the time, that's really, really surprising how this question actually moved. Because in the beginning, we were talking about weapons, of course, but sanctions. That was remember the dominant conversation in the beginning. From the beginning, we have always these running questions about party preferences. We only put that data out on a larger scale with this report, the War on the Vote. But I can tell you that when you look through the German data and the supporters for the different parties, you could clearly see that the notion that, for example, the Social Democrats do move slowly on the issue because their supporters are not in favor was just plainly wrong. It was plainly wrong. Also was plainly wrong that the CDU, it took much more forceful positions because their supporters were in favor of more tougher policies, also wrong. Or let's say not supported by our data. So interesting question, long answer. It is a bit confusing. I cannot, all I can tell you is that narratives are very strong and we can only poke little holes with our data. We have not been able to change that narrative so far.
Thanks a lot. So Putin should not draw much hope from your opinion polls.
No. I mean, the party of the peace movement, the Greens, right? These are, to this day, the strongest support of delivering weapons and tough policies towards Russia. Just as it is.
Okay, thank you. That was very interesting. We have a few minutes for some comments. I know some names of people, and I think they could bring valuable contribution to the conversation, but we are not at school. I don't want to call them by names. Okay,
There's also one in the chat, Stefano.
Where there is one in the chat. Yeah, exactly. Paolo, I don't know who he is, says, thank you for your speech and data. May you please comment the actual and not so weak support for Putin in Italy? Have in mind a quite dated poll, 7% of Italians justify Russia in attacking Ukraine. Is it possible? Personally, I find also very questionable. Some candidates in PD as Sala, I think he means Cecilia Strada, and Marco Tarquinio, for their specific position on the war, as well as some lists as Santoro's one with a piece in its logo and the 5-star movement. Okay, no, I think it's very focused. Maybe we can go back to that slides, and if Isabel can go to the slides with the Italian parties, because I think that there is an answer now. The next one with the split for parties. And go on to Ukraine and delivering weapons, which is the way we frame. Okay, here. I think that we see the reason why the Democratic Party candidated Cecilia Strada and Marco Tarquinio, because its voters are exactly split, almost close to 50-50. So maybe the question should be, I add another question, is it something that is consistent with the trend you see in the data, that if your voters are split equally, you take both sides at the same time? So you candidate people who strongly support weapons to Ukraine, and you candidate also people who are strongly against sending weapons to Ukraine in the very same party. Is it something that is meaningful?
Well, you have, I think, some countries. I think within the Dutch case, for example, I think, to be honest, but I can also, to Isabel, at least if you compared to the Dutch case, there's less division within the parties, but more cross. But that's probably also because we have 26 parties, so many of these people would have moved to a different party already when they would have. But I think that what you do see of certain parties is that then they're say, well, because in the Netherlands the big issue was accession. No one wanted accession. And I mean, even if you take of people like the VVD, so the former governing party of Wilders, of Freudian slip, I'm already in the new government, the party of Rutte, that he, of course, also with positioning himself for NATO, General Secretary was already, very much pro-accession, where his party was not. And there you saw that they were speaking with two voices. So some people were saying, okay, yeah, maybe it's our duty, but so there you did see this kind of strategic. So I think it does matter. And maybe also, Stephanie, you have some ideas. I think that, for example, this issue of delivering weapons and the issue of NATO and the issue of what peace means is very strong in the Italian. Also, you see it in some of the Spanish data. You see that less in the Dutch data because the Dutch are very Anglo-Saxon. So NATO is not the issue. But what the issue really was should we let a country like Ukraine access the European Union? The Dutch were not so super enthusiastic about previous rounds of accession, right? So like that's been more the hurdle than this delivering of weapons. And I think that the delivering of weapons, where I was also more surprised myself in the Italian debate, that there was a lot of discussion like, oh, was this because of NATO, right? The initial discussion about who is responsible for the war and so on. That was a very different discussion, let's say, than you would see. It's very similar in Spain. And I do think that has to do with also the difficulty in the left to think about what they want on this defense side, right? Okay, we want to have peace, but we're not willing to kind of give some weapons for it. And we don't want to do it in a quote American fashion, Anglo-Saxon fashion in NATO, right? And these kind of tensions, I think you see on the left in some Southern European countries much more, for example. I do know also from the German case, I mean, some of those issues have also split the Social Democratic Party in Germany, right? On some of these. So I think it's sometimes you see that the Ukrainian issue creates these divisions, but on different aspects of let's say the war, right? Like, is it accession? Is it weapon deliveries? Is it? And then you see some of these issues are more difficult for the left. Some of them are more difficult for the right. If they always position different candidates, I mean, that I think a lot of the candidate positioning also really depends on the internal issues in the party. But I definitely think that you see them trying to deal a little bit strategically with the ambiguity that they have on some of these issues. So that fits your PD explanation, I think.
Okay, thank you. And Isabella, is it correct to understand the data as our viewer say that maybe these numbers are explained with the previous how to say positive attitude towards Putin, and maybe with the skepticism with liberal democracy and so on? Because if it's correct, probably we should see that the same people who are against delivering weapons, they are also more skeptical on European defense and other things. And if I understood correctly, this is not that clear from the data.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, the stakes do not get any higher than when it is issues are about over peace and war. Huh? So this is a very high stake issue we're trading here. First question. I think when we look at the baseline attitude towards these issues and the following policies, then political culture obviously plays a large role, where the different countries are coming from, particularly when it touches upon issues of actually warfare. And there are also how strong are the relations or the interdependencies and as a community, or also by different individual, the consequences that are actually felt or feared, right? I very, very largely, I would open a picture like that of different different level that could explain how public opinion moves in these sort of issues. I mean, connections between Russia and Germany, and Russia and Italy, I believe, very strong. Economic ties very strong. I remember during the pandemic, Putin put up a huge show. I don't know if he really came through. He hardly ever does, but you tell me. But there was a playing field of political connections, of economic connections, and of political history, economic history, political culture that can explain why the numbers are like that. Yeah, I just look at the time and think it's a vast topic, but we should finish.
That was a very useful reminder of what happened in the very recent past of Italy in terms of connection with Putin and its propaganda machine. So thank you, Isabel, for that. We have a very maybe time for super final comment if someone want to take the last opportunities. Otherwise, I don't see any digital hand, so let me just thank very much both Catherine and Isabel for this very important work, which is just a piece of a much bigger effort of giving us a scientifically sound way to frame the discussion in this electoral campaign, which is as usual more noisy and national oriented than we would like to see, but I mean that's what politics is. So thanks to your opinions and Catherine and Isabel, at least we have some evidence to put to contribute to this discussion in a more effective way, which is something that we will keep on trying and that we'll do in the next few weeks. So we have plenty of initiatives. I don't want to make the list now, but you will find them on the website. Maybe if you are in Milan, or you can join us in person or remotely on May the 30th at Egea Bookshop, where we'll have another round of discussion on the geopolitics of European elections with our friend of Le Grand Continent. So you find everything online. So let me just thank you again, Catherine and Isabel, and also my colleague Georgia and Silvia, Georgia Bosco and Silvia Tesauro, who organized the meeting. So thank you all, and see you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.